Hello, my dear Franken friends, and welcome to Spookyou, your one-stop shop for all things ghastly and ghoulish. I'm your host, Barnabas Vixen. How horrible of you to join us. Curl up, invite your friends, and by all means, make sure those lights are out. That way it's harder to tell what may or may not be lurking around you. There's nothing like a good mystery, am I right? Tonight will feature a singular tale of devilish design, curated by those wicked weavers of woe. And without further ado, allow me to pass the reins on over to our vivacious voiceover virtuoso, Trey Falco, for tonight's sinister story. Please keep all limbs and side covers at all times. We wouldn't want anything to go missing now, would we?
I've always had this thing about basements. A primordial tension deep in my gut for as long as I can remember. And for a while, I thought it was just a childish fear of the dark that I outgrew, but now looking back, I'm not so sure. When I was 7, my father followed a contract out of our hometown and liked the area. There, an uncrossable distance away from everything I'd ever known, we'd built our first house. It was just about the most marvelous and terrifying thing I'd ever seen. A bare skeletal structure rising from the dead pit in the earth, and for a while I could watch from the outside as its muscles and nerves grew frantically with the claps of nail guns and the banging of hammers. And then it shrugged on walls like a new skin, giving it a massive hulking form and supernatural life. On dusky evenings when my father and his crew worked in the yard, I spent my time running between the beams of stark framework walls by the reflection of industrial lamplight, washing in through empty window frames. The thrill of eerie solitude sent chills down my spine, but I was always comforted by the whir of saws and boisterous voices that floated in from the lawn. In the back corner of the house, the gaping black maw of the stairwell to the basement beckoned with vacuous magnetism. I would sometimes venture back and peer down into the darkness, the smell of new cement and freshly molded corners wafting upwards. And at one point, I got up the courage to venture about halfway downward. The receding construction racket and utter lack of light encroaching around the dimly illuminated landing struck me with a sense of my defenseless smallness. It felt like something was down there, lurking outside of my perception, waiting for me. The thought sent me scrambling up the steps with echoing woody smacks pursuing me on my ascent. We ended up using the basement as storage when the house was built and furnished, so I never had to enter it again. However, the door would occasionally hang open and I would quicken my pace as I passed it, getting assaulted by a quick whiff of mildewy concrete. The smell was a stagnant whip assaulting my sinuses and filling my chest with a habitual sense of small, tender fragility against inscrutable brutality, the physical manifestation of fear. When I was 9, we went bankrupt and moved in with my parental grandparents. Their house was the kind that was always complaining and ghostly suggestions of creaks and groans. It felt more than a little off-putting. And weird stuff happened all over, from random light flickers to various vacantly smiling Garfield figurines dropping off of the desk in the office, to radio static occasionally creeping up the basement steps, even though the only radio down there was unplugged. They had 2 refrigerator-freezer combinations, and much to my chagrin, the one that housed the sodas and popsicles was in the basement. Its cold concrete floors were covered by large area rugs, antiquated wallpaper dotted with rosemary sprigs, and lined with watchful bouquets of pansies and daisies peeled from the walls to reveal more of the unforgiving stone. It had the uniquely sharp and stale smell of mothballs, dust, and old glue. But over all of that, I could still detect the musty, moldy concrete odor that seemed to slice directly into my amygdala and extract shockwaves of fearful adrenaline. To make things worse, the staircase was walled in with no visibility to the room below, and the only light was a bulb in the middle of the ceiling that was connected to a pull switch. I memorized the path down to the switch, 15 steps down and turn a tight right to avoid the boxes stacked against the opposite wall, and then swerve left to avoid the big oak desk sitting by the staircase, and a straight 10 steps to the middle of the room. I perfected it down to a science. I could make it all the way from the doorway to the light faster than Garfield could inhale an entire dish of lasagna. A coat rack and old piano with a beautifully engraved scallop headboard sat at the farthest wall, and when I was still slow enough to let my eyes adjust slightly, their phantasmal silhouettes made my heart thrum.
Finally! We've been trying for eons to reach you about your plow horse's extended warranty. Please remain on the line while we transfer you to one of our account fairies. While I'm sure you'd love to get back to that living nightmare, I've got something far more exciting. One of our wretched sponsors. Tell me, listener, have you been having trouble down there? There's no reason to be embarrassed. It happens to everyone at times. It even happened to my grandfather. That's where Brainy Bob's Grave Services comes into play. When you just can't possibly get those old bones up like you used to and roll around in your grave, Brainy Bob's delicate caretakers are here to assist you. On call 24/7 whenever you're feeling in the mood. I guarantee you'll be left feeling like your younger self. Please seek an apothecary if symptoms last longer than 4 eons. It could be considered a mystical emergency. Brainy Bob's Grave Services, shaking the dust off dysfunctional bones since 1203. I suppose now it's time to return you to your story, though you really should look into that, plow horse warranty.
Once, the figure of the rack seemed to heave and oscillate, and I thought I saw a deathly thin limb loom and reach out of it toward me. I ran elbow first into the corner of the desk and nearly tripped over myself, reeling from the unpleasant jolt of lightning that shot to my fingertips, and running to get to the middle of the room as quickly as possible. And when I finally pulled the switch, it was just the same old bunch of coats sitting there, taunting me. After I'd collected my sugary prizes, I would walk slowly to the center of the room and pause for a second to mentally prepare myself. And then I'd pull the switch again and get out as fast as my memory allowed, clambering, terrified and noisy, up the thinly carpeted steps. I'm sure my grandparents heard my panicked footfalls from the kitchen, but they never brought the treats to the main fridge. And from there, we jumped around from apartment to apartment for years. No basements, but I did still have to sleep with the light on in each new room for a couple of months to get adjusted. And after some time, I'd feel comfortable enough to reduce to a night light that casted only dim light and familiarly ambiguous shadows across the walls around me. And the older I grew, the more my parents joked about my anxiety, and the more determined I got to put my fears to rest to avoid the ridicule. I finally unplugged my nightlight one night in a fit of indignant determination and found that I could make out the known shapes of my belongings and choose to find comfort in them. When I was 14, we moved into a small, one-story house with a finished basement, and my parents decided over my vehement protests that I should have the room with the door that was directly adjacent to the door to the stairwell, so that my father could have an office space with a window that faced east towards the sunrise. Nevertheless, I decided the first night to sleep with no light whatsoever, door closed so that I could shock myself out of my aversion to the dark. I spent many of those initial nights with my eyes glued open, darting around the room and resting on the opposite wall to take stock of the mysterious gloom of the entry door, waiting for a cloud of ink to slink fluidly from the keyhole so near the entrance to the void below. After hours of this, I would finally fall into fitful, recurring nightmares in which I would be chased up an endless, dank, and mildewy staircase by a shifting, shadowy figure. And once in a while, the unknowable creature would inexplicably pause some distance down to give me a chance to catch my breath, and I'd turn to examine up the steps and measure the remaining distance to get to the comforting light of the doorway. And when I looked back down, it would be right on my heels, and I would once again turn and run breathlessly toward the light, which seemed to have extended much further upward from where it was at last glance. I'd often wake in a cold sweat with the unnerving sense memory still firmly rooted in my brain. And sometimes I'd get up to get a glass of water, and I'd walk past the darkened, doorless stairs with the recollection of the smell seeming to tingle in my nostrils as I passed. As the months in the house turned to years and the constant instability of my childhood faded from memory, I developed a sense of security in my surroundings. The creamy plaster walls and thick, fluffy beige carpeting in the basement held no musty odor, and there were 2 light switches, one at the top of the steps and one at the lower landing. I eventually found a sense of solace and independence lounging down there in solitude, journaling or watching TV. And after that, the nightmares stopped. I began to let go of my fear. I went off to college right after high school and immediately found what I thought was a dream romance. We said "I love you" to each other in the first 2 weeks of our relationship and moved into an apartment together after 6 months. Sleeping with her at my side was initially comforting, as if our love sheltered me from the uncertainty of the unfamiliar dark, and I could fall asleep with no unnecessary stress and sleep through the night with only pleasant dreams. However, living in such close proximity soon added tension to the new relationship. We found that the commonalities and upbringing that we'd bonded over bred similar neuroses that clashed spectacularly. Insecurity, jealousy, and difference made unbearable bedfellows. I fell into a depression and took to anesthetizing with drugs and alcohol, which only exacerbated the problems. She would shout at me about my inability to be around her if I wasn't high or drunk, and once she even backed me into a corner and punched the wall right next to my head in a blind rage. All the while, we enabled each other's maladaptive, manipulative behavior. I blamed myself for her angry outburst, and she blamed herself for a perceived inability to take care of me and make me happy. Sometimes, in a fit of anxiety, I ran outside the apartment crying. What I thought was the perfect romance turned out to be the perfect storm. The suffocating stairwell returned to me in my dreams. Unlike the ones I'd seen in the past, the shadow would draw me downward with a hypnotic charm, and I'd go to it and be enveloped in darkness. Black ink clouding my vision and overwhelming me with intolerable despair, anxiety, and uncertainty. I'd awaken in the night and stare across the bed at my love's somber silhouette, feeling remorse for the pain and anger I was causing her. The dark seemed to twist around her frame, and I would look out, once again searching for unfamiliar shadows slithering in the sinister murk. Our room became a prison for me, a place where I spent all my nights in breathless disquiet, overcome with distressed despondence by my frayed nerves. Eventually, I started sleeping in the living room, and there, swaddled by refreshing seclusion, the dark was nothing but quietly consoling. In a safe, neutral environment, the gloom seemed to grieve with me, and with its quiet patience, it encouraged me to end the relationship. From then on, the absence of light didn't seem so blindingly terrifying. Instead, within it, I felt like I could finally relax and see. And I dismissed my fear entirely after that. Until recently.
Welcome back, my darling deviants. Well, tell me, did you enjoy that twisted tale? Of course you did. I knew you had that air about you, that hunger for the horrific and the macabre. So, did we spook you? If not, then file a complaint with our complaint department detailing all accounts of non-spookiness you found in this video, and we'll get back to you in 2 to 3 millennia. Give or take a business eon or two. However, if you've enjoyed what you've just heard this evening, then make sure you leave a like on this video and annihilate that subscribe button. Such a small act of obedience is exactly what we need to put the food on the table around here. There's only so many days we can have refried kidney and toe jam hash before I'm absolutely sick of it. Spoiler alert, that ship sailed long ago. Now, I must bid you adieu. I've many things to take care of, and this outro is eating into my day off. Run along now. Have no fear, we'll be here every Tuesday and Thursday to bring you another terrible tale. Go forth, my ghastly gang, and stay spooky.